The following video and very existence of this channel is made possible by your support over on patreon.com/616entertainment. I couldn't do this without you, and I thank you kindly for keeping the dream alive. Want a kick-ass shirt? Head on over to prowrestlingtees.com/616entertainment and pick one up. Founded in 1993, the Ultimate Fighting Championship was created to prove once and for all, in a fight with no rules and no weight classes, which martial art reigned supreme. Could a boxer beat a wrestler? Could a taekwondo or karate practitioner defeat a jiu-jitsu or judo specialist? Everyone wanted to know, and there was only one way to find out. This wasn't some stupid waste of time, could Superman beat Goku garbage. This was a real question, with a real answer waiting in the wings. For the first several years the UFC existed, it was clear that barely anybody knew what the hell was going on, including those locked inside the cage. At the very first event, boxer Art Jimerson famously battled Royce Gracie with one glove on. Times have changed, huh? Today, we all recognize the octagon, the setting for each and every UFC fight. But this cage wasn't always the plan. At one point, electrified fences were considered. The idea of a floating platform surrounded by a moat filled with alligators and sharks was even tossed out. And no, I'm not kidding. With as ridiculous as the Ultimate Fighting Championship was, and honestly still is sometimes, one had to wonder, when was there going to be a video game of this? It would take some time, a long time actually, but here in 2023, we're currently waiting for the official announcement of the 14th UFC video game. Over the next 6 months here on youtube.com/616entertainment, I'll take you through the entire account. Welcome to the history of UFC video games part 1, as real as it gets. Oh, what's up DanDans? My name is Ian. I cannot wait to get to work here today. Covering the video games of the UFC is something I have wanted to do for a long time, but I had to wait until the timing was perfect. You know, this is something that you can only do one time. Now today's video, part 1, is indeed going to focus on the original Ultimate Fighting Championship game, available on the Dreamcast, PlayStation, and the Game Boy Color. Part 2 will jump into the next generation on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox. Part 3 will combine the undisputed trilogy on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Part 4 won't feature any UFC games, but rather their competitors, which range from very, very good to very, very bad. And the big finale, Part 5, will close it out with the EA Sports era. Now, if you're on board with all that, or maybe you've been on board with some of the other stuff that I do around here, consider signing up over on patreon.com/616entertainment. Every new sign up is one step closer to unlocking a gigantic new video retrospective. Batman games, Ninja Turtles, Spider-Man, Grand Theft Auto, Metal Gear Solid, the history of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. You can help me put these videos together. I can't do it without you, so thanks for your help. No more plugging, no more promoting, let's get to it. This is the history of UFC video games. As previously stated, the UFC was founded in 1993. We're looking at 30 years of organized, high-level, mainstream mixed martial arts at this point. On one hand, it's crazy how young this sport is. On the other hand, as a longtime follower who has been a fan for about 20 years now, it's crazy how far it's all come. As a quick little background on me, the first UFC pay-per-view I was ever able to order was UFC 61, Bitter Rivals. As a kid who grew up a huge pro wrestling fan, it was absolutely Ken Shamrock who caught my attention for mixed martial arts. He was a wrestling guy, you know? I knew him. I watched him kick ass in a performance art environment. I kinda wanted to watch him kick ass for real. If you're watching this and you're a wrestling fan who isn't into the UFC or MMA in general, look at it like this. You might not care about the Suicide Squad, but when you hear John Cena is in it and he's awesome as this DC Comics character Peacemaker, you go, man, I kinda wanna watch John Cena shoot some people. It's the same thing. Okay, maybe it's not the same thing, but it's similar. I knew from pro wrestling that Ken Shamrock was a legit fighter. I specifically recall my dad knowing who he was and telling me he was an absolute destroyer. By the time I became a fan of mixed martial arts, it was 2004. The Ultimate Fighter was on Spike TV, it came on right after Monday Night Raw, and the main event of the big finale show was Ken Shamrock versus Rich Franklin. At this point, Ken Shamrock was no longer the destroyer I'd heard about. He was no longer the world's most dangerous man. He was far, far past his prime. This guy Rich Franklin, a dude I'd never heard of, beat Ken down fairly easily, finishing him just past the 2-minute mark of the very first round. I learned several things that day, with one of the biggest takeaways being that MMA and pro wrestling are not created equal. If this were WrestleMania, the old legend would have turned away the young, hungry lion in triumphant fashion, and we all would have cheered our hearts out. But this wasn't WrestleMania. This was real life. And in real life, the old guard are often sacrificed to the next generation. Remember my first pay-per-view, UFC 61, Bitter Rivals? One of the headlining attractions was Ken Shamrock versus Tito Ortiz 2, a blood feud rematch. Tito flattened Ken 78 seconds into the fight. Shamrock protested the stoppage, and 3 months later, a Trilogy fight took place. Ortiz left zero doubt, demolishing Shamrock in 2 minutes and 23 seconds, and absolutely breaking my heart. I'm telling you all this to set the scene. This sport comes with the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, and the video games based on this great sport are no different. Now, the Ultimate Fighting Championship may have been founded in 1993, but I was not exaggerating when I stated that it would take quite a while for the company to receive its first video game adaptation. And I realize you want to hear about the UFC's video games today. You're not here for an in-depth history lesson on the company itself. But long story short, the UFC was not making money for a long time. It was constantly hemorrhaging cash, and unlike the professional fighting landscape, there's no cut man for your financials. There's no quick fix coagulant that somebody can plug into your wallet. Putting a video game together is unlike producing any other type of merchandise. You can't develop a game as quickly as you can print a t-shirt or a poster, and many great opportunities were missed. With no merchandising partners and really not much financial success to speak of at all, we never got a game of the UFC's early years. Can you imagine a UFC game with Hoist Gracie, Dan Severn, Art Jimerson, and Ken Shamrock on the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis? We've got WWF Royal Rumble from that era, WCW Super Brawl Wrestling. On the boxing side of things, we had Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and its Super Nintendo sequel. George Foreman and Buster Douglas had their own games, so on and so forth. But the stars did not align in the right formation, and a 16-bit UFC game never came to fruition. 7 years after the company was founded, its first video game would hit store shelves. Simply titled Ultimate Fighting Championship, the game was developed initially for and would release first on Sega's Dreamcast console, with Anchor Inc. at the helm. If Anchor Inc. is a familiar name to you, you've either played Toy Fighter in arcades, or you just recently watched my Triangle X Squared Circle retrospective on WWF Raw, where I wrote damn near the same script for this section. Anchor Inc. was brought together by Tekken alumni Masahiro Onoguchi, and with 3D fighting games being the man's bread and butter, it would seem that a transition into the realm of mixed martial arts gaming might be an easy one to make. It's worth noting that I'll be covering the PlayStation version of the game in today's video, because that's the version I own, and that's the one I have experience with. I've never owned a Dreamcast in my life, and growing up, only one of my friends had a Dreamcast, so I can't speak to this iteration with any authority. The PlayStation port was handled by Opus, most famous for their work on Half Minute Hero and Beat Planet. Or Fighter's Destiny. I don't know what the hell you know them for. What, I gotta go through their entire resume? The Dreamcast release from Anchor Inc. is unmistakably the superior version. You can tell by looking at them side by side, or you can compare reviews, whichever you prefer. The Dreamcast version looks much better, it runs much better, it plays much better, and that's all there is to it. If you're waiting for a, but the PlayStation version has this, that's not coming, so don't hold your breath. We're about to dive into the gameplay, the presentation, the full package. And I just want to state this at the top. I don't want to dangle a carrot at the end of the stick. This is not a good game. Now, the Sega Dreamcast version is the best version that was made. It was much more reminiscent of the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube versions that we'll cover next time out. But the PS1 port, yeah, not the best. Presentation is important, right? And presentation, honestly, is the high point of this game. Check out the entrances, the stage, the walkway. We've got entrance music. I mean, everyone's entrance music is the same, and there's only one stage in the entire game, but it's something, right? A much better game from this time period would be WWF SmackDown 2, and pro wrestling is much more dependent on its theatrics. But SmackDown 2's entrances suck. There's no stage, no ramp, no audience. UFC wins out here. Not by much, but it does. Another high point comes in the shape of the legendary voice of the Octagon, Bruce Buffer, who delivers full introductions for each fighter before the bell rings.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin
Referee Big John McCarthy is right there in the cage to keep an eye on the action, and his trademark catchphrase kickstarts every showdown.
Are you ready? Are you ready? Well, let's get it on!
Between rounds, the Octagon girls parade around the cage. The blood flying from a fighter's face after taking considerable damage is an awesome detail. And that's about it when it comes to positives, unfortunately. I wish that weren't the case, but it is what it is. Maybe I'll find something else, I'll stumble across something else that I want to put over as this video rolls on, but as it stands, I'm all out of things to brag about. It's time to take an in-depth look at the gameplay, and that unfortunately comes with taking a turn into the negative. I don't want to try to teach you how to play the game. This is a retrospective, not a tutorial. But the fact of the matter is this. This game makes you feel like you cannot move. You know how you can't throw punches in your dreams, or all of your movements are really slow, like you're underwater? That's what Ultimate Fighting Championship on the PlayStation feels like. And I stress, this is what it feels like on PlayStation. Here's some Dreamcast footage. See how smooth it is? See how much nicer it looks? But we didn't have this. We had this. And when I say we, I'm talking about the kids who grew up with a PlayStation, which I and many others did. In the grand scheme, the Sega Dreamcast sold just over 30 million units. The PlayStation sold over 102 million units. And I understand that there may be a contingent of the audience that are upset that I'm not covering the superior version of the game, but I have to tell my stories. I can't make things up for convenience. So yeah, I, and many others, our only option was this. And it sucks. According to the instruction manual, shooting a takedown is triggered by pressing square and triangle at the same time, but I cannot get it to work at all. And hold on, square and triangle? How many games in existence have ever asked the player to press square and triangle at the same time? Not many, and for good reason. Later games in the series would change this. I wonder why. There's really no strategy involved in any fight. It's senseless. It's rock'em sock'em stupidity. In Mortal Kombat, you've got special moves you can pull off, but you gotta be careful to avoid your opponent's specials as well. In wrestling games, you've often got to deal with speed differentials, or maybe you've got to stay aware of whether your opponent has a finisher from the standing position or the top rope. In this game, there's nothing. There's really no difference in the way anybody fights. Chuck Liddell, known for his heavy hands and knockout power, will take you down and submit you the same way Frank Shamrock would. There's no stamina meter either, so it's not like you can work on sapping the other guy's gas tank before looking for a choke. No. Just attempt the choke 15 or 16 times and maybe eventually you'll get it. Or maybe you'll get him the first time, who knows. In my experience, it is extremely rare for a fight in this game to end on the feet with a knockout. And by that, I mean in the several hours of gameplay I captured, it did not happen one time. So I don't even have footage to show you. A submission or knockout from the mounted position is how 95% of your fights are going to end. Why are so many orthodox fighters standing southpaw in this game? Why are there no weight classes? This game was released in 2000. The UFC introduced weight classes in 1997. There are 22 fighters on the roster of all shapes and sizes, and man, 22 is not a lot. Again, comparing to similar games of the time, WWF SmackDown 2 featured 66 playable wrestlers. And not only is it small, but Ultimate Fighting Championship's 22 fighter roster isn't exactly an all-star lineup. We've got Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Mark Coleman, Evan Tanner, Bas Rutten, and other big names of the time. But Andre Roberts? I mean no disrespect to the man himself, it's just like, we don't have Jens Pulver or Tank Abbott or Vitor Belfort, but we have Andre Roberts? The game itself is more disrespectful to him than I am. Under his strengths, they've listed claims improved stamina. Claims! Like, hey, we don't even believe him, but he says he's in better shape. Yeah, right. Wow. Look at the fighters' bodies. Look at Jeremy Horn. This barely resembles a human being. Look at his legs and feet in comparison to the rest of him. Look at Chuck Liddell's head. Gary Goodridge looks pretty good. He's even got his Superman tattoo on his right arm, which is interesting. I don't know how they got away with that, but good lord, most of these guys look oblong and ghoulish. Now, I know that was pretty harsh, but like I always say, this is a retrospective. I'm not trying to put together a commercial to sell you on this game. I'm just calling it like it is. The gameplay sucks. The representations of the fighters are straight up pitiful. But hey, you could always create your own fighter and try out some design work for yourself. I threw my own guy together to see if he felt any different, and no, he doesn't. If anything, I think I'm just surprised there's a creative fighter mode at all. But even though he plays the same as everyone else does, who cares? Let's look at the ins and outs of this mode. DanDan Buttman is his name, and when it comes to his strengths, I'd like to think these were made up by his bum-ass manager or something. Hey, what's he good at? Aw, listen! Strength over techniques. Some submission, good submission. Look at some of the fighting styles we can assign to our guy. Sumo? Ninjutsu? Ridiculous. By the time this game released, it represented a UFC that no longer existed. It was late to the party, and when it finally arrived, it was wearing a Halloween costume in December. Hey, what the hell is with this game's startup having a silent screen that just reads, "Fight like a man"? What is that? Fight like a man? As opposed to what? A robot? An animal? Whatever. Now, we've been talking about the PlayStation version of Ultimate Fighting Championship up to this point, but like I mentioned earlier, there is a third port of the game on Game Boy Color. Thanks to longtime DanDan Mr. Beef, I now have a Super Nintendo and a Super Game Boy. I went on eBay and bought a Game Boy Color copy of Ultimate Fighting Championship specifically to cover it for you here today, and it doesn't work. I did not know that Game Boy Color games don't work with Super Game Boy. So that was $15 right down the toilet. But look, the Game Boy Color port was developed by Fluid Studios, the team behind Army Men, Air Combat, and the 2001 E.T. game. This version reviewed terribly, as you might imagine. I cannot lend any personal stories to this portion of the video for obvious reasons, but I tried my best. I guess I'll just have to use this Super Game Boy for something else. When it came down to it, the critical reception to the UFC's first video game depended on where you played it. If you owned a Dreamcast, you know, the more powerful, more advanced hardware, you were riding pretty high, and this was a fairly impressive first outing. PlayStation owners were not so lucky, with heavy, unresponsive controls and ugly graphics ruining the overall package. And Game Boy Color players, I mean, nobody bought this game on Game Boy Color. What are we talking about? Going forward, the UFC itself would continue to evolve, as would their video game offerings. It would not be another 7-year wait for a follow-up. No, no, no. From 2002 to 2004, the UFC would release 4 more games across the next generation of consoles. What would the Octagon look and feel like on the Xbox, GameCube, and PlayStation 2? Hey, we'll talk all about it next time. Oh, there it is. Thank you for joining me for the history of UFC video games Part 1, as real as it gets. Now, I understand that this initial entry ranges from impressive to repulsive, but we're only heading up from here. This entire history of Retrospective series is not going to be all negative, I assure you. If you like this video and you want to see me go in depth on other classics like the Grand Theft Auto series, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Spider-Man games, Batman games, and more, you can help bring those videos to life by signing up at any level over on patreon.com/616entertainment. These are videos that will not be produced without your support. So if there's something on screen that you are interested in, don't waste any time signing up for as little as $2 a month, and I will get to work. Thank you so much for joining me here today, and I hope to see you next time out for the history of UFC video games Part 2, Face the Pain. Until then, I love ya, and I will see you next time.